Welcome back welcome to the first opening panel of our conference, Helsinki and Diplomacy, Power and Limitations. I want to introduce the panelists to you. Unfortunately, as you've already heard, we had to learn last week that one of our panelists, Jaakko Laajava, passed away. We were and still are shocked by this news and wish to remember him also with this, our panel. In our preparatory meeting, Jaakko already had a very interesting exchange with Martin Palouš. He wanted to give us his views on how we got to the final act and would have wanted to explain the international context. Jaakko's absence is deeply felt by us today and by all who knew him. Let's start with our panel, Helsinki and Diplomacy. We want to ask, what role did diplomacy play during the Cold War? What significance did the Helsinki Final Act have for diplomatic actors as well as activists and dissidents in East and West? And the panel will also discuss at the end the possibilities and constraints of diplomacy in current conflicts. To discuss these questions, we have a panel of experts, some who took part in the events, others who've worked as diplomats or scholars on the conference and related themes. I think Michael needs no more introduction. He's introduced himself with his opening keynote, which gave us much thought for discussion, as we will see. I will introduce Sia Spiliopoulou Åkermark, who sits next to me. Sia is an expert in international law, an NGO consultant for minorities and law and diversity. She's professor at Akademi University. Before joining Akademi, she was the director of the Åland Island Peace Institute from 2007 to 2023. Previously, she worked at the Faculty of Law at Uppsala University in Sweden, from where she holds her doctoral degree. She served as expert and president of the Advisory Committee of the Framework Convention on National Minorities in the Council of Europe and as member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Tornedalen in Sweden. Next to Michael is Henryka Mościcka-Dendys, a diplomat since around 2000, who studied politics and law. She's a diplomat and Undersecretary of State at the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She worked at the Polish Embassy in Berlin and was head of the coordination unit at the ministry's European Union Department and expert for the CBSS Commissioner on Democratic Development in Copenhagen. She was Poland's ambassador to Denmark from 2015 till 2020, and afterwards she headed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Bureau of Investments. Next to her is Martin Palouš, Director of International Cooperation of the Remembrance Society and a member of the Council of the Czech Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. He was one of the original signatories of Charter 77, served as its spokesman in 1986, and was among the founders of the Czech Civic Forum in 1989. After the fall of communism, he was a member of Parliament, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Ambassador of the Czech Republic to the United States and to the United Nations. So we have a contemporary witness, an activist, a civil rights activist, and a diplomat in one person on the panel. Welcome, Martin. And finally, I'll introduce Kristina Spohr, an expert in international history. She's professor of international history at the London School of Economics and senior fellow at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at SAIS Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. She's author of a book entitled Post-Wall, Post-Square, Rebuilding the World After 1989, whose German edition appeared under the title Wendezeit and won the award as Politikwissenschaftliche Buch 2020. Welcome to all of you and to the structure of the panel. As you see, we have a diverse panel of persons active at the time or afterwards in civil rights movement or in diplomacy, some scholars, and of scholars in international relations and international law. diverse also in terms of countries they've served or studied: Finland, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic, Germany, international organizations, diplomacy, and Europe. Above all, a European perspective. The agenda for this panel is that each of the panelists have 5 minutes in the start to give an introductory statement, and please, 5 minutes only. And then we have a first, second, and third round of questions and responses. I'll encourage you to discuss among each other. We've got about 30 minutes for this. If possible, we will then open up to the audience, questions from the audience, and then have a final round, basically on today's perspective on Helsinki and the possibilities which Michael hinted at, and the visions we may have for today. With that, I'm happy to pass on the word. And Martin, if you would like to start. Yeah, of course, yeah.
First of all, thanks for inviting me to participate in this important event. 5 minutes is a really horrible time pressure, and especially for me, because I don't know whether I should start from 1975, when I was a young man living in normalized Czechoslovakia, trying to find my way out from the current personal crisis we were all in. Or should I look back from my later perspective, studies, or being diplomat later, and so on and so forth? I will stick to 1975 only and leave everything else out.
Good.
I wanted to alert, to turn your attention to a very important document, Václav Havel's letter, Dear Dr. Husák. That was all published in April of 1975. It was a letter written in a language diplomats don't like, too long, too specific, and typical Havelian text, in which he described a situation as he saw normalized Czechoslovakia. No more riots on the streets, no more lively public discussions, students back in classes, and everything normal. And even no any visible humanitarian problems at all. So Havel said, Dr. Husák, you might think that your policies were successful and that you are winning. But I would like to alert you that this is only surface. Something wrong is going inside of the society, and you as a politician should act accordingly, do the right thing. And maybe Havel didn't know at that moment that Husák was to be elected president a couple of weeks later, and then he was going to go to Helsinki to sign the Final Act. So my connection is Havel versus President Husák here in the Plenaria Hall. I know that I've almost 5 minutes, but let me to finish by quoting from Václav Havel's letter to Dr. Husák. So he says to him, it looks like that you were successful, but may I make a bold as to answer no. To assert that for all the outwardly persuasive facts, inwardly, our society, far from being a consolidated one, is, on the contrary, plunging ever deeper into a crisis, more dangerous in some respect than any we have recall in our recent history. Very bold statement. The basic question one must ask is this: why are people, in fact, behaving in the way they do? Why do they do all these things that, taken together, form impressive image of a totally united society, giving total support to the government? For any unprejudiced observer, the answer is, I think, self-evident. They are driven to it by fear. So far, it is the worst in us which is being systematically activated and enlarged: egotism, hypocrisy, indifference, cowardice, fear, resignation, and the desire to escape every personal responsibility, regardless of the general consequences. So for you and your government have chosen the easy way out for yourselves and the most dangerous road for society, the path of inner decay for the sake of outward appearances, of deadening life for the sake of increasing uniformity, of deepening the spiritual and moral crisis of our society, and ceaselessly degrading human dignity for the punny sake of protecting your own power. As a citizen of this country, I thereby request, openly and publicly, that you and the leading representatives of the present regime consider seriously the matters to which I have tried to draw your attention, that you assess in their light the degree of your historic responsibility and act accordingly. So the question is whether Dr. Husák acted accordingly here in Finlandia Hall. Certainly he had a very different concept of Helsinki process, that's how it was perceived by Havel and us. Havel's letter had a tremendous effect. It was some sort of proto-samizdat. It started to be disseminated among people, so when 2 years later, Charter 77 was created as a strange entity, non-entity, Václav Havel's message was there, and we tried to act accordingly and communicate with the regime in a right way. Last thing, what the Helsinki process did for us was that it legitimized our position in international community. That when years were passing, and especially after 1989, we were taken as members of those who are allowed to participate in international dialogue in the process of Helsinki. If Mr. Brezhnev wanted to suggest these peaceful relations between states with different social and political systems as a status quo strategy, I think processuality won, and process turned out to be much stronger element than status quo, and I think this is the lesson even for us today. We must look at processes and not just trying to keep status quo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, particularly for the quote, which actually gives pertinence to the Michael's thesis on the crisis, but gives it from a different point of view, from the internal point of view of those seeking a different kind of legitimacy Michael was talking about. We'll pass on, and Sia, may I ask you to give your introductory statement?
Thank you very much. I would like to ask how many of you have used this kind of toy. It's a kaleidoscope. So most of you would know what it means. If you haven't, it will be here. You can check it during the next break. I hope that you will then remember the main message that I will be trying to convey. And that is that as the kaleidoscope, which has been around for not more than 200 years, it was invented by a Scot in 1817, we are very often confronted with a plurality of glass fragments that are realigned in new patterns, often very beautiful patterns. And this is a Greek word, so kalos and skopeo, you look on the beautiful pattern. So I will be trying to look at these patterns, the continuities and the changes where law has played a role. I will also recall yesterday's excellent discussion referring to the UN Charter and the ambiguity of the discussion, the ideational dimensions of the UN Charter on the one side, and the more geopolitical take of Michael Sandowski, but also referring to the actual use, precisely as you, Michael, referred today, the actual use of the Charter. Also, Martin did that, even though it was not legally binding. So a combination of these ideational and geopolitical elements. But of course, your perspective on what the Helsinki Final Act means depends also where you are actually geographically situated. and what your conditions in your society are. In the 1960s, the number of states had globally increased, and the protests against Vietnam were signaling that even the world's most potent power was not immune to the criticism and public opposition, not only on the basis of the UN Charter, but also the Geneva Conventions on Humanitarian Law from 1949. So laws apply not only to peace, which was the goal of the Helsinki process, but also to war. As this is a panel on diplomacy and coexistence, I would like to recall that two very important steps had taken place in the midst of the Cold War tensions of the 1960s. On the one hand, we had the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. So it established that diplomacy was protected and that it was possible to coexist in spite of differences, establishing the idea of a plurality of global visions. So reaffirming in this sense also the UN Charter and opening up for what was then taking place in Helsinki. At the same time, we find, I think, a very interesting tension in the definition of diplomacy in the Vienna Convention. On the one hand, it's about promoting, and all the Excellencies ambassadors here know that better than anyone, promoting your own interests, the interests of your own country, and at the same time working for cooperative projects, finding solutions to new problems. So the self-centered, egoistic perspective is combined with this relational perspective, whereas also yesterday was meant both sides need to be valued and seen. Well, not very long after the Vienna Convention, Dag Hammarskjöld was assassinated as UN Secretary General in the Congo, where the Cold War was playing out at its full. So the Cold War is not only about the East-West perspective that we sometimes seem to think of when we are situated in Helsinki or in Stockholm. And diplomacy was, in fact, a dangerous occupation. In 1969, we saw the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And I'm not mentioning these just to give you a lesson in law. I'm mentioning these because they are, of course, challenged today. I will quote a very dear friend, a legal philosopher from Holland, who has said very nicely that law is needed among strangers. Law is a reaffirmation of the plurality. Totalitarianism does not need law, because the law is the voice of the power holder. In 1975, from another perspective, the International Court of Justice adopted its advisory opinion on Western Sahara. I don't need to say much more. You see the continuity between 1975 and 2024, and we can discuss that later on. I will not cover Jaakko's many thoughts and experiences, but I would like to end up by saying two things from a Finnish perspective. In some ways, the 1975 outcomes is a continuity to the League of Nations efforts. On the one hand, the conviction that we need arms control and disarmament discussions. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972 had been adopted, and later on the US exited in 2002. And in another respect, minority issues were reintroduced in the European arena in 1975. And Finland has been a strong voice in issues of minority issues. You can imagine Finland as a kaleidoscope with 3 pieces, perhaps, or you can imagine Finland as an icebreaker, the small state that is trying to create some small room of maneuver with 3 glass fragments. And I think these fragments are a continuity as I read Finnish modern history. On the one hand, clearly a strong defense, but not alone. Coupled with strong institutions of the rule of law and a very active bilaterally and multilaterally diplomacy. So this triangulation is trying to create the space that a country in an awkward in-between position is trying to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sia, for this sort of definition of diplomacy with its 2 trajectories, interest and cooperation, which is, of course, to the heart of what we are talking about at Helsinki in the past, and on the rule of law and the role of law, both of which are slightly different and which open up spaces. Let's continue with Kristina.
Right. So I'm coming to this as a historian, and when I listened to what Jaakko had said in the Zoom, I just would like to point out that he reminded us that he had just entered the foreign ministry when he sent the invitations to these multilateral talks that took place in Dipoli. And when Petri Hakkarainen this morning said that, you know, he was kind of a child of this time because he wasn't even born yet. I guess 1975 was the first summer when I, as a German-Finnish child, took my very first steps in my life in this country, having been born just previously. So I want to think about this Helsinki Final Act from a historical perspective. The Helsinki Final Act as an agreement, not a treaty, and I want to remind you that agreements and summit documents or acts, they are all the expression of multiple wills, not of a single unitary will. And agreements such as the Helsinki Final Act are the point at which diverse interests and motivations converge. And they were represented, of course, at the summit by the various statesmen, and they were all men at the time. And making sense of that is, I think, crucial for understanding the underlying political and ideological tensions inherent in a compromise document, and also why certain agreements endure, and the Helsinki Final Act or the Paris Charter, as we have it, endures, and others do not. So I think it is worth, while thinking for my 4.5 minutes that I have left, on what brought these stakeholders to the table, what were they hoping to achieve and why, and sort of what was the outcome. So in that sense, I'm a bit picking up from what Michael said, perhaps in a slightly different way. So the Helsinki Summit, it was 3 decades after World War II, a little bit less than when we now look back at 1989, 1991. So that is sort of the distance of time if you now sort of try to think back where you were 3 decades ago. That's how it was for the people then. It was a crisis-beset 1970s, economic and energy crisis, socio-economic crisis. You have heard all of that in that East-West context, that divide. We were in that Cold War, some have called it the long peace, and it was about, at that point, trying to make it livable in those moments of crisis, but also livable after, the Berlin-Cuban Missile Crisis, when we had come to the brink of nuclear war. And it was about, on the one hand, the empire by imposition, the Soviet Union and what they wanted. It was also about America and Canada as European powers, because they came to sit at this conference here in Helsinki. It was about Soviet anxiety for wanting to be seen as equal and about its sphere of influence. But in this, what we heard from Michael, this crisis also of legitimacy on both sides as regards to the superpowers, it was also about the agency of Europeans, especially small neutral states, and I come to talk about that a little bit later, and also for Germany. and the unresolved German question, and in that context, one question we haven't talked about yet, the unresolved Baltic question, two questions deriving from World War II. And so we had this conference on security and cooperation in Europe, which shows you, then you think about the participants, that the geography had been enlarged from Europe per se, and also the notion of security and what it means when you think about basket 2 and basket 3, and this element of stability versus cooperation and transcending the Cold War, the transformative aspect, played a role. So what can we say about motivations of those present at the table, and what did they press for? So I want to remind you that the Soviets were really, really keen on this conference. They actually wanted to have it. And why did they want to have it? And why do I believe that actually Brezhnev wasn't that unhappy when he left Helsinki in terms of what their obsession was? And that relates to principles that we still talk about today. Sovereign equality, inviolability of frontiers, territorial integrity, peaceful settlement of disputes, and non-intervention in internal affairs. Why did it matter to the Soviets? Because they wanted to cement the territorial status quo in stone, because they wanted to be certain what their sphere was, because Helsinki for them with basket 1 was the de facto peace treaty they didn't have, especially as regards to Germany, for example. For Finland, this was quite different. It was the host. It could have and hold the summit. It could get credibility and legitimacy as a small state bordering Russia on the global plane. It could show its status, its sovereignty and full independence. It could show to the world it had a place on the map as a liberal democracy and free market economy. It could showcase that to the world. And what about, for example, the West Germans who happened, thanks to the French alphabet, to sit here right next to East Germany after the signing of the basic treaty and both Germanys having 2 seats at the UN, whereas the East Germans followed the Soviet agenda, the West Germans wanted peaceful change of borders, human rights provisions, in other words, Kontaktpolitik as regards to East Germany, cooperation and self-determination of the people, so Germans could get unification one day on the basis of self-determination, considering East Germans did not have that self-determination. That's how the West Germans had put it in their basic law. And the Germans wanted baskets 2 and 3, economic, scientific, technological cooperation, normalization of relations with the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union in particular, and basket 3, the human rights baskets, all to alleviate also in a national interest sense the pain of division. So cooperation went hand in hand with normalization. It tied to Ostpolitik. It tied also to the idea of Wandel durch Annäherung. You have rapprochement if you have change. But there were tensions inherent, and so I'm coming to round off my little spiel over these real motivations. Because on the one hand, you see status quo politic by the Russians, and inherently the possibility to peacefully change something, the transformative power. And we didn't know in which direction it was going to go. But the document entailed all these things. The document was work in progress. The document opened a process of follow-up conferences, because remember, this was a conference, not a peace treaty, not something set in stone, in what was the cockpit of the Cold War in Europe with that wider notion. And final point, let's remember, the UN Secretary General was an honorary guest. And why do I make this point? Because the UN was created, and that was, being present at the creation of something new, at the presence at a moment when we never again wanted world war again. Those are sort of the ideas behind the UN Charter, those in the context of making the Cold War livable, perhaps transcending it, perhaps diffusing tensions, perhaps having more stability, predictability, and cooperation was at the heart of the Helsinki Final Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristina, for drawing our attention to the fact that it was an agreement may have very different interests in it and can be interpreted differently, and for drawing attention to what is European and what is international and global about Helsinki. I think that's a point we have not yet discussed so far. Henryka, would you like to make your statement?
Thank you very much. First of all, many thanks to the organizers for having me here. I understand I'm the only non-historian at this very panel, so the challenge is big. But I should also say to the organizers, congratulations on the 20th anniversary of the network, Solidarity and Remembrance. It's also an important anniversary. It's really good to be back in Helsinki. And I should also say, looking at the Helsinki Final Act, I would like to encourage you to use this historical perspective to see the Final Act as in its pertinence to today's international relations. There is a lot we can learn and a lot we can reinterpret, let's say, from the perspective of the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. First of all, the Finnish diplomacy back then, and I say it looking at Petri, it grasped the momentum to offer a floor for this kind of dialogue. And if you look at today's activities of our Finnish friends, in particular the Finnish president, Alex Stubb, we see the same in the transatlantic relations. Playing golf can be instrumental in international relations. But this, jokes aside, when you look at the world of today and the principles enshrined or listed in the Final Act of 1975, Professor Spohr just listed them. Sovereignty of states, peaceful resolution of conflicts, non-violation of borders, non-interventions. This being used by the then Moscow, Soviet Moscow, and today's situation in Europe, in particular on our eastern borders in Russia/Ukraine. Russia doing exactly the opposite to safeguard its sphere of influence. Back in 1975, Russia was using the Final Act in order to safeguard its sphere of influence. Professor Spohr just perfectly described this context, and Professor Morgan did it in his introductory lecture. Nowadays, Russia is doing exactly the opposite, violating the principles to which they actually have testified to in many different fora. Let's remember, Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. When we say the Final Act was not legally binding, this is not necessary. It's true on the level of formalities, but all the principles which were listed in the Final Act actually have their basis in UN frameworks, in different international treaties, starting with the UN Charter. So in that sense, there was a very strong content of the Final Act, the principles we still regard as valid. And why is it important? We see in today's geopolitical order tectonic shifts. We see paradigm changes, be it in the transatlantic agenda, be it in China, in the relations in Southeastern Asia, and in other spots. We see the world which was created after 1945 trembling. It is in its fundamental aspirations or rules. So looking at the instruments which have been implemented in the last 50 years, even in the times of Cold War, we can maybe learn something and draw conclusions for the future, how to stabilize our basic interests and how to gain from that, and how to prove some basic principles wrong, as in the case of violation of or the war in Ukraine, simply saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kristina, for going to the present. With that, I'll return to Michael. If you take all these four as a comment on your lecture, how would you respond?
Thanks. And thanks to my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be having this conversation with you. I would emphasize two major points coming out of our discussion here and yesterday evening. The first point has to do with conflict, and the second point has to do with timing. First on conflict. It's common, it's tempting in diplomatic circumstances and diplomatic venues to speak about the Final Act, to speak about diplomacy as the art of dialogue, as the art of mutual understanding, as the art of toleration and the peaceful settlement of disputes and so on. But I think the essence of the negotiations that produced the Final Act was conflict. If war is the continuation of politics by other means, we can say that diplomacy is the continuation of war by other means. And what we saw in the Helsinki negotiations was the conflict between radically different ideas of peace, radically different ideas of the future of Europe, radically different ideas of legitimacy. To give you a couple of concrete examples, which have come up just on the panel so far today. The future of European borders. At the beginning of the Helsinki negotiations, what the Soviets wanted was a declaration that borders would be immutable. Immutable, that is to say, permanent, that they would not be changed, that Germany would never be reunified. What the Western countries wanted, and in fact what they got in the text of the Final Act, was not immutability, but rather inviolability. A subtle difference, but with profound philosophical and political implications. What the Final Act said was not that borders cannot be changed, but rather that they cannot be changed by force. It can be changed peacefully. And so the difference between immutability and inviolability, you may say these are just linguistic games, but they are linguistic games with profound consequences and implications for the future of Europe. And they exemplify this conflict that's at the heart of the process. Another example. The Helsinki Final Act forbids non-intervention in the affairs of other countries. That's not what the Soviets wanted. What the Soviets wanted was non-interference, another subtle difference. The Soviet vision was that states would entirely keep their hands off other countries, would not interfere, would not spread their ideas, would not spread books, would not spread movies, would not engage with the citizens of other countries. There would be total isolation between different societies. That was the Soviet vision. The Western vision was non-intervention, which is to say the non-use of military force to intervene in the domestic affairs of other countries. It was defined strictly in military terms, which permitted the broadcast of radio programs, the circulation of books, the circulation of ideas, the circulation of people. And so again, that conflict between non-intervention and non-interference was fundamental to the CSCE. So I would say on this point about conflict, yes, peaceful dialogue matters. But what Helsinki shows is that that peaceful dialogue can be, maybe must be, a way of dealing with, a way of negotiating, a way of fighting these deeper philosophical, political, diplomatic battles. Second point about timing. It's very difficult to imagine now, in light of the war in Ukraine, another process like the Helsinki process starting in 2025. But it would have been difficult in 1968, in the wake of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, to imagine the Helsinki process starting. That would have seemed impossible in 1968. And yet, 4 years later, the preparatory talks started at Dipoli. That's a rapid turnaround. So what I would suggest is that even though things diplomatically seem very bleak in Europe right now, we should remember that things can turn around. The situation can change very, very quickly. Opportunities can open up in unexpected ways and with unexpected speed. And that makes it crucial, before those opportunities arise, to think about what liberal democratic governments might want, what their visions of the future of Europe might be before the opportunity arises, so that they will be prepared to seize those opportunities when they come. Thank you.
I think if I can pass on the word to Martin, picking up probably on what you said last, and Sia.
Somewhat provocative comment. Obviously, for me, 68 was a year. I was a teenager, and it was a formative year for me. But obviously, the Soviet invasion, or Soviet-led invasion, was a dramatic intervention to my personal plans. Why Brezhnev decided to push for it was not already in his mind his concept of peaceful relations between two systems, East and West, was connection between 68 and then what started maybe a couple of years later already in his mind or not. I think that for him, these disturbances like Czechoslovakian experiment with socialism, with human face or whatever we had, for me it was not on that level. I never was a communist. I never had this type of experience. I was a teenager. I wanted to travel. I wanted to live as other members of my generation in the West or everywhere. But I think that maybe Brezhnev already had his concept of peaceful relations between these two systems, with all these questions, non-intervention and connectivity between legal obligations and political commitments. What was very important then was this processuality. But this process, I'm afraid, started with what Brezhnev did to me and to people of my generation. Is it something meaningful, or does it make any sense what I'm saying?
We'll have Sia and then Kristina.
Yes, I've been listening to the discussion with great interest, and I liked very much the reference to the letter of Havel to Husak, because I think that it really describes a process of self-reflection, a process of what is our society going through, what is happening, and what is the needs that we actually have. And this process of self-reflection, so the movement from within, was at least as important as the pressures and the diplomatic activities from the outside. So I think this is something we can really take with us. And someone said it yesterday, you cannot help someone who doesn't want to be helped. And that confirms with what you were saying. So perhaps we can return to the issue, where do we actually stand now? Because I'm not convinced, and I would like to return to that, how much transformative potential did the CSCE have for us in the so-called West?
Kristina?
First, to pick up from what you said, I would agree, actually. I would say that because the Soviet Union or the Soviet Empire at large was at the biggest extent that it kind of expected to be, it was all about consolidating it, precisely because what it did in Prague was in some ways defensive. And to consolidate it was in part also through what they saw, these particular principles in Basket 1. And so in that sense, the Soviet Union as regards Europe was in fact a country that was a status quo power wanting to cement what it had. If we now fast forward to the present, it's exactly the opposite. It felt that it was, it felt itself that for some reason it's humiliated, it has lost out, and therefore Putin started to think about both revisionism and revanchism. But in this case, revisionism isn't, say, something transformative that was relevant to the Balts or to the West Germans or whatever on these open questions in the Cold War context, but it's actually tied to imperialism. And so actually it's now, and that's why it's so interesting, Moscow originally wanted these principles. Now it's happy to break them because it uses now history to sort of say, actually, we want to go in terms of territory to something else, and we want to go what we lost because the loss of the Soviet Empire was the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century. And so we are quite happy to have a war of conquest. So the Cold War in that sense, which was a sort of frozen conflict, if you so want, now we have war of aggression, war of conquest, something very territorial, and it's revisionist and revanchist. And why are we still talking about holding on to these principles? Well, when we came out of World War I and World War II, I think there was this great sense, how do we prevent that from ever happening again? And what are sort of values and norms and principles if we don't want to go to war all the time based on the strength of the fittest? Great power politics over China and Russia when they now talk about a post-West world order, when they say some countries are more sovereign than others. There is no equal sovereignty or sovereign equality. Small and big are not the same. The big ones are allowed to have spheres of influence and they can impose in that sphere what they want. Well, that's very 19th century. And why are we holding on to what we consider Western, or Gorbachev called it universal values? Call it what you want if we sign up to this. These were sort of gains we had achieved through universal voting rights, freedom of speech, freedoms everybody wanted. And incidentally, which at the end of the Cold War, when we had diffused and transcended that old East-West divide, the Russians signed under Yeltsin up to themselves. They talked about democratization, they talked about free market, they talked about pluralism, but it was still born. And there was never a reckoning that this is what had happened.
And Henryka, you wanted to come in?
Just one sentence, because Professor Spohr now inspired me to maybe put a stamp on exactly the sentence about using the same values for very opposite goals. Back in 1975, the Soviet Union, or maybe for the same goal but with other means, back in 1975, the Soviet Union tried to safeguard its sphere of influence and thereby recognize the values because felt this would lead to safeguarding the empire. This was what Professor Morgan also underlined. Today, Russia is breaking the very same principles under the same motto of restoring its sphere of influence. It uses a different, let's say, logic more from the 19th century, but based on the very same principle of being allowed to do more because it's a big power. And I think this is something we should really take serious in our considerations when talking about Europe of today or the global order. But I would also like to underline one more aspect which hasn't been mentioned yet. The universal values, the human rights agenda. These were issues which the Helsinki conference actually bolstered. And through the sequence of international conferences later on, made, let's say, the bulk of activities of the OSCE, including ODIHR, the Institution for Democratic Development, for human rights, for election supervision, nowadays with its seat in Warsaw. The question is, what will be left from that system if we cannot agree to simple values in the world of today?
Martin?
Actually, in the cover of your excellent book, Final Act, there are two presidents, General Secretary Brezhnev and Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford, I think, is rather political realist and not idealist. He was advised by Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger's relationship to Helsinki process was interesting. Let's put it diplomatically. But the question was the final act sort of victory of political realists, or was it something in between, or was value-based politics rather seen invisible, so that it helped these two presidents to participate in it? Was global relationships key factor, or just it was in the context of European civilization? It was post-Vietnam also context. What do you think?
On the question of realism and idealism, which is a distinction that scholars of international relations often draw, I think that the final act challenges that typical distinction. It's true that Kissinger and Ford, Nixon before him, were not particularly interested in the CSCE. They did not think that this would change very much. This, from their perspective, this was just a piece of paper. What really mattered was nuclear arms control, was the ABM treaty. Those were the things that were really significant to the future of international relations. But what's so interesting, I think, about Helsinki is that it demonstrates, one could say, the fusion, the possibility of fusing realist and idealist perspectives. What I mean by that is this. It demonstrates that states can use ideas, which is typically dismissed as the province of idealists, of idealism, of wishful thinking. States can use ideas to serve power political goals, to serve very hard-headed, very pragmatic, in some ways revisionist goals, that ideas can have real power and force in international affairs. It's not just military force that matters. So what that means for Helsinki is that I think it demonstrates that the distinction that countries sometimes draw, that academics sometimes draw between hard power and soft power is actually a mistake. It demonstrates that that what really is crucially important is not whether or not ideas are included or excluded. What matters is how do you define the ideas that are at stake? So, for example, it's often said that the final act was a declaration about human rights. It was an agreement about human rights. We often refer to basket 3 as the human rights basket. I would argue that that is not quite right. It's not quite correct. The Soviets had no trouble with the idea of human rights, as long as human rights were defined in the terms that they preferred. They could endorse socialist concepts of human rights. They had no trouble with that. So what mattered in Helsinki was not the endorsement of human rights in general. It was the particular vision of human rights written into the final act, written into basket 3. It was a Western understanding of human rights, not human rights in a broad sense, but human rights in a very pointed, very particular, almost aggressive sense, crafted, defined in a way to undermine the foundations of Soviet power. So not human rights in general, but the human rights of freedom of information, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, and so on. So to say that Helsinki was a document about human rights, in a way, misses the point. What matters about Helsinki is the particular concept of human rights, the particular concept of peace, the particular concept of cooperation that it instantiates. And in all of those respects, I have to say it was a victory for the Western vision and a defeat for the Soviet vision.
May I just take up Sia's point? about the transformative power of the Act and ask all of you, before I open up to questions from the audience, if this is paper, baskets, articles, what actually gave this paper a power? What does it take to get from 1975, say, to 1985, 88, 89? Could you try to respond to that? What gives power to that paper? If it hasn't any power of its own, and I'm not sure whether the norms have the power of their own, they have to be taken up and put into practice. So if we could have your views on that. I don't know who wants to start. Sia, you
yes.
get it.
Thank you. I'd like to take issue with this idea of a very coherent Western human rights understanding. Because of course we know that, to take Sweden as an example, Sweden didn't really think that the European Convention was of any real importance. Everything was fine in Sweden until the late 80s. So I think the transformative potential here is this understanding that there is a lot of spectrum within the discussion of what human rights means at a certain place, at a certain moment of time. And even though we do have these pronunciations and quite general statements, these need to be made a reality on the ground. And they are made a reality all the time. And whether, I wouldn't want to pronounce yet whether the West or the Soviets won. I think it's too early to pronounce on this. Because what we see at the moment is a questioning in Europe of some of the fundaments that we have built our idea of the rule of law. Of course, there was a tremendous potential and a tremendous development in issues of minorities, and we can return to that. We weren't able to deal with the Yugoslav wars, which haven't been mentioned yet. And it was the first real test case, in some sense, of the conference on cooperation in Europe. So what we see now with the open letter of the 9 states, some of them are here, questioning the European Convention on Human Rights, questioning the European Court of Human Rights, well, I'm sure that there are people in Moscow who are smiling at the moment. So there is a lot of potential, but we are also making very many grave mistakes. But people around the world have spoken. They have said, we want the treaty on the prohibition on nuclear weapons. So there is potential here. They have said in a cooperation between China and Canada pushing for the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. There is potential here. So I don't want to be only dark in my kaleidoscopic view. There is some light here and there.
Martin?
I'll just react to what Professor Morgan said concerning concept of human rights. In a very important book, Reflections on Revolution in Europe, Ralph Dahrendorf appreciated the spirit of Paris Charter by speaking about 3 unifications. Unification of Europe, Germany, specific question, and language. All of a sudden, when one said human rights, we could hope that more or less we are like-minded. There is some sort of homonoia, maybe not the sameness, but similarity. The problem, obviously, was that the period of unifications was quickly replaced by a period of fragmentations. Czechoslovakia maybe was the best velvet divorce, but we had Soviet Union disappearing and Yugoslavia. And then also transformation of conference for security cooperation in Europe to organization. So my question would be, this spirit of conference was maybe more productive, more creative, more dynamic then organization that is now part of this interlocking institutions existing in Europe, and we can endlessly discuss what is the place of OSCE between the Council of Europe and European Union and NATO and so on and so forth.
Kristina?
I think I want to remind us that context matters, because I think it would be dangerous to look at 1975 and then sort of draw one-way streets and saying, oh yeah, there was the Helsinki Final Act, and then Bob the uncle, 20 years later, we have, the end of the Cold War, because obviously, there was a diffusing in terms of superpower arms control, nuclear weapons, treaties. We had the Gorbachev factor, we heard yesterday, Markus Meckel pointed that out. The abolition of the Brezhnev doctrine, the freedom of choice, that galvanized people without the fear of the tank to go into the street. And we heard about the material changes also, what happened to the command economy versus, the technological moving ahead, and the Western world, rising again economically in the 1980s from colleague Zantovsky. So things change, and in that context, we can use something. But seeing we have these agreements and normative principles, I think certain elements were important. So for the Germans, when unification suddenly became an option and Chancellor Kohl and Genscher seized on it, they were thinking, is German unification going to happen first, or is first happening some kind of pan-European CSCE, some kind of European coming together and the German question being resolved within that? Well, it came all completely differently, but those things were on the table. The selling of taking the inner German border away under the CSCE principle was possible in the 2+4 treaty because there was a reference to the CSCE, and Gorbachev could agree with that. And also, that a unified Germany would be in NATO, and all these kind of things. So I think those things we have to take away, like the right to self-determination, the Baltics' re-establishment of independence, other countries using self-determination. Always having these reference points that we have negotiated, that is what matters when we can make these agreements work for us, if we really sort of fill words with meaning. And final point, when we talk about the Helsinki effect, and we are happily sitting in the Finlandia Hall, and, then you hear some Americans say just a year ago, oh, yeah, it was so great, the Finns at the Helsinki conference, and they were neutral, and that made them so happy, and that's wonderful. I have a Finnish colleague, Johannes Aunesloma, he could tell you all about, whether neutrality is the best option, or actually, the worst of, many other options, but you try and make it work. But then to sell that to the Ukraine and say, well, never mind equal sovereignty or the freedom to choose an alliance or the freedom to choose to wanting to join the EU or NATO. No. Why don't you go with some sort of Finlandization, Finnish solution, and listen and keep the Russians happy next door? I think there are all these analogies that are really problematic. So we must remember what of those principles really matter, how do we apply them and fill them with real meaning. And then we can, I think, move ahead and think about where we want to be after ceasefire, peace treaties, and so forth. But if we do not fill those principles with meaning, if we can't even back them up militarily, as Markus Meckel said yesterday, if we just have words, then it's worthless.
Well, if I may throw in 2 points. I mean, if we look at after 1975, we also have to think of Afghanistan, of Poland in 1980, of rearmament. Cannot just draw a line from 1975 to 1989. And then ask the question, what was actually the vision in 1989-90? Was there a vision that actually carried some way? Perhaps that, but with that, I'd like to open it to the public. Is there a microphone in the room? Just in the front row.
Thank you to all the panelists for their wonderful contributions. And I'd like to make a small comment on something that, in my mind, throws some light on the fundamental mystery of the Final Act, and that is why the Soviets thought that they walked away with a major triumph, whereas, in fact, they carried away the seed of their own destruction. And in my mind, this is the contradiction between the Chapter 6 and the Chapter 7 of the Final Act, and the Chapter 6 is the chapter on non-intervention in the affairs of the participating states, and And you, Michael, rightly spoke about the subtle distinction between non-intervention and non-interference. But then the final act was a declaration. It was not an international agreement, meaning there is no binding text, English or French or of the agreement. And I just looked at the Czech text from 1975 of the agreement, which speaks of nevměšování, which in Czech is non-interference. And I'm very certain that if you look at the Russian text of the treaty, of the final act, it would say the same thing. So, and I remember the media echo of those days. They all spoke about, you know, from now on they will not interfere in our internal affairs. Wonderful. And then you have the chapter 7, which is the chapter on human rights. Yeah, and you're absolutely right that, you know, one of the victories was the very specific definition of individual human rights, the right to freedom, expression, political activity, etc., etc. And there is the concept of non-interference can be read, it's a repetition of the Westphalian concept of eius regio cuius religio. You know, we decide what our religion will be in our own country. But the chapter 7 speaks about the universal character. And I think the word universal is the giveaway. Because if it's a universal concern for all the participating states, then it's not interference when we spoke about it with respect to other countries, which is exactly what the supporters of the dissidents in the west of the dissidents in Central and Eastern Europe did for the opposition movements in the late 1970s and 1980s. Yeah, this was the crucial point. Thank you.
I think we take 2 or 3 more. There's this gentleman, the one in the back, and Markus Meckler. And then we have them respond and then have another round, if there's time.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot. First of all, Michael, that was a masterclass in public speaking. And see the kaleidoscope thing, I really enjoyed that. So the words that have stuck out in all of this, I think Martin mentioned creativity, and then everyone's talked about ideas and visioning in particular. Now, my colleague and I, we're from Northern Ireland, where we work for one of the peace institutions. And it was a visioning process in Northern Ireland in the 1980s that got us unstuck for the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And when we look back on that now, we can plot what the visioning process looked like. But at the time, it wasn't a structured process. Nobody really knew they were creating visions. So my question, Michael, you talked about visioning, but it's the whole panel. If you want to create those visions now before the opportunities come, do you have any advice on how you tangibly start a visioning process or what you do to create visions?
Yep. Just in front of you. Yep.
Thank you for the very interesting presentations. I just wanted to make one small criticism. The Principle 7 is human rights, and Basket 3 had to do with human contacts and basically contacts between East and West. So I know they're often thrown together, especially even Jimmy Carter did this. But of course, that's one thing I think should be noted. Secondly, in terms of visions, of course, you have to have certain people who are trying to bring the vision forward or create the new vision. I would say that under Jimmy Carter, his instrumentalization of human rights in the CSCE process, which angered many West European countries, not all of them, but very many, especially West Germany, because they were focused on Basket 3 as opposed to Principle 7, that this was very important, especially what Arthur Goldberg then did at Belgrade, which upset everybody else, right? And third, I wanted to say, of course, you can talk about diplomacy and principles, et cetera, but I would argue that the driving force for Soviet concessions in the CSCE process, especially in the 1980s, was the so-called NATO double-track decision. They were trying to derail the stationing of US Euro missiles, and they tried to do this through the CSCE process. They were unsuccessful in the end, but it's interesting that there was this compromise at the end of the Madrid meeting. It was because the Americans agreed to compromise because they wanted to be sure the missiles were stationed in Europe, and basically Helmut Kohl convinced them you need to compromise for public opinion in West Germany. And the Soviets compromised because they thought this is how we finally stop them from stationing it, using the CSCE process to support the peace movements in Western Europe to stop the stationing. So in that sense, great power politics or other factors of power didn't end with the CSCE Final Act by no means whatsoever.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. I would like to remember two situations in the negotiations of German unification in 1990. There was that meeting between Bush and Gorbachev in the end of May. And in these meetings, President Bush referred to the first principle of the Final Act, the freedom of every state to choose its alliance. And the answer, he was a little bit reluctant, but then he said, yes, we agree with that. That was the first agreement of Gorbachev for German unification, including the possibility and opportunity to choose NATO as its alliance. I think that's very important, that reference, because Gorbachev was sticking to that, what Soviet Union signed in 1975. Second remark, this was told me, I was not present in that negotiations. Kristina was there. We had a conference 5 years ago in Washington with negotiators of that time. And one of them told that Gorbachev, in that negotiations, when the Americans spoke about the Western values of human rights, Gorbachev said, these are not Western values. I think these are universal. These are ours too. This could be a voice of Moscow too in that time.
We'll give the panel a chance and then have a second round. If you just wait a moment, we'll have the panel respond. Kristina, Martin.
Yeah, I would definitely underwrite this aspect that, Kontaktpolitik really mattered to the Germans because they wanted to keep the nation together when you had the de jure two states. And I kept also thinking, I didn't mention it before, the West German, the Egon Bahr statement was Wandel durch Annäherung, change zu rapprochement, which was behind Ostpolitik. All, of course, within the context that West Germany was a NATO and EC member. So Westpolitik was always, the founding pillar in this. And then you could sort of open out to the East. The East Germans called it Aggression auf Filzlatschen, aggression on felt socks, right? So they were quite aware why you needed that wall and the boundary, and they were very careful about this whole Kontaktpolitik, which had to be managed. And I do think what Markus just highlighted, it was actually at the Malta summit in December 1989 when Gorbachev and Bush talked about this common or universal values, and it points you to this inherent question among Russian leaders and also about the Russian Empire, or even if we now call it a Eurasian empire from the Baltic to the Pacific, still is, even in sort of rump state form. This aspect, is it more European or is it more whatever that Russianness is, what you see in the Putin Millennium Manifesto? And Gorbachev, of course, wanted some kind of socialist, democratic, European kind of Soviet Union, a reinvented Soviet Union that could co-develop. And that's why I think it was easier for him to talk about these common and universal values. However, when you say, well, actually, we need to be othering ourselves because Russianness is something else than Westernness, by which they don't necessarily mean European sort of culture or literature or things like that, but notably anything sort of associated with the Anglo-American world and the United States, because after all, whoever is in charge in the United States, it's always wanting to be recognized as that second big power in the world, leading global ordering power, as you have seen in the last 100 years, the United States. And that is what sort of drives the Russians. And I think it is actually the Janus-facedness of the Russians that sometimes makes this quite difficult to then sort of know, what do we really mean by East and West? And, are these geographic, ideological, or whatever terms? And I think that's what we need to think about.
I would like to go back to my first statement about Havel and philosophy. Because if we want to find definitions of human rights, I would also recommend you to read what Jan Patočka, one of the first spokespersons of Charter 77, wrote about human rights in January, February, just a couple of months, so weeks before he passed away after the police interrogation. He only wanted to connect legal concepts with morality. That even states must recognize that something higher than their own will and concept of self-preservation. That there is some sort of deeper civilizational layer that we need to bring back in a dialogue to help us to understand the situation. Obviously, I don't think that diplomats here in Finlandia were philosophers, but they had to be confronted with that dimension, maybe unwillingly. And it's extremely important. I also studied law later, so I understand what are the legal problems. We should also speak about general principles of law or customary law and how we want to bring these big universal elements or arguments to our daily human rights discussion. But morality, I think, should not be mixed with law, but the relationship between them is extremely important. And maybe my contribution to German debate. Henry Kissinger was of German descent, and his big teacher was Hans Morgenthau. So I think that this European dimension was present even in the arch-realists in American foreign politics. And maybe this was also one of the elements why German reunification went so smoothly. These 4+2 talks, they were not part of Helsinki process, but they were surprisingly fast. And Markus was part of that and led in October of 1919, even before Paris Charter, to very specific result, and we can discuss it in the context of NATO enlargement or all of that. But in this time, I would say philosophy and German traditions were also in action.
Do you want to? You don't have to. But
Not really, but maybe just one sentence, because I missed this context in our discussion. Some of you said Russians were going out of Helsinki with this, let's say, seed of their self-destruction. And indeed, it was so. And I think it's important to mention that the Helsinki Final Act also had this this aspect of let's say, empower, just to use a Havelian phrase again, of empowering the powerless. The seeds of civic society in our countries. I grew up behind the Iron Curtain, so I still remember the first Solidarność movement, and Lech Wałęsa and people gathering around them. I also remember Charter 77, the Helsinki committees being created all over Eastern Europe back then. It was really something quite unique, which started after the Helsinki process in a completely new dimension, and led also to 1989. In Poland, in between, we had the martial law and the party striking back, the Communist Party back then. But still, I think there was a joint belief that acting together, the civic society can actually bring a change about in the societies.
Let me start with a word on the question of imagining. How does that process actually happen? What does it look like? I'm a historian. I can't speak from firsthand experience. There are many practitioners in the room, many veterans of this process who can speak to it. But I can talk about what I've seen in the documents and what I gleaned from interviewing some of the participants. The process of imagining, the creative process that went into at least the Western side of the Helsinki negotiations was messy. It was boring. It was lengthy. What did that look like in practice? It looked like meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, producing stacks and stacks and stacks of papers and working documents and proposals. And I'm just talking about the internal Western consultations before the CSCE itself started. So what that process of imagining looked like in the case of Helsinki was brainstorming, the collision of a plurality of ideas, the willingness to tolerate disagreement. And I think this is one of the paradoxical strengths of the Western participants during the CSCE. They did not agree with each other. And that process of arguing with each other generated ideas that were more useful, more viable than would have been the case had they simply come to consensus instantly. And you see this point if you look at the internal Warsaw Pact process leading up to the CSCE. That process was not messy. It was not particularly extended. It didn't involve a whole lot of conflict, a little bit around the edges. But broadly speaking, the Soviets devised the goals and told their allies what those goals would be and expected their allies to fall into line. So the process of imagining, paradoxically for the West, was so successful precisely because it was so painful, because it was so boring, because it was so time-consuming. And so in a sense, the great virtue of the Western powers was their patience, was their willingness to stick to the process even when it was difficult, was their determination to outlast their interlocutors. Now this raises the question, why did the Final Act have any power? It was just a piece of paper. It was not binding under international law. What gave it power? The Soviet desire for respectability, the Soviet desire for legitimacy, the Soviet desire to be treated as a status quo power, as a member of the Club of Nations. So when historians or political scientists say that the Final Act was a time bomb planted under the Soviet Union, that's true, but only because the Soviets were willing to stick to the process. Because Vladimir Putin Leonid Brezhnev wanted international legitimacy. If Vladimir Putin had been General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party in 1975, if he had been willing to shred or abandon Soviet international legitimacy, the Final Act would have had no impact whatsoever. If Mikhail Gorbachev had not become General Secretary in 1985, it's hard to imagine too many other Soviet leaders signing up to universal values. So a big part of what gave the Final Act its power was this Soviet desire to be recognized as legitimate, to be recognized as a full member of the Club of Nations. And so what that means for today, I think, is that until Russia, until Vladimir Putin, or whoever succeeds him, develops that same desire for international legitimacy, the power of diplomacy is going to be limited. Now, that Soviet desire for recognition, for legitimacy and so on, the power of the Final Act, did not erase the fact that there were tensions in the text itself. There were ambiguities in the text itself, not least between sovereignty and universal human rights. The Final Act, the end of the Cold War, did not resolve that tension. And in some ways, the case of the wars in the former Yugoslavia demonstrates that tension between sovereignty and universal human rights. And there have been attempts to resolve that tension through things like the responsibility to protect, but I think governments are still wrestling with this tension. They've been wrestling with it for 500 years in a way. And I don't think that tension is going to be resolved anytime soon, unfortunately.
Yes, well, it's difficult to be a bit heretic towards the end, but I think we need to be a little bit more broad in our take, because the Helsinki Final Act and the process that led to it was not the only thing taking place around, not even in Europe. We had a process of democratization, especially in the southern part of the continent, that also questioned both the Soviet side as well as the Western side, saying that the vision is not to be on the one or the other side, but to have a plurality of voices, whatever the side you choose may be. And I'm very happy that Ireland was mentioned, because it also shows that at that time, Great Britain became a part of European integration after many difficult discussions, as also Denmark chose to do in the end, which wasn't self-evident. And Denmark is interesting because we know that Khrushchev had a very nice time back in 1964 in Denmark, visiting the home of Jens Otto Krag and his family. So already at that time, the process of rapprochement was going on. It was not even only in the late 70s, in the late 60s and early 70s. So it takes a lot of time, which means that we cannot only invest, it's also a question of investing interest and investing money. We cannot simply invest in defense. We have to invest in defense, most people would say. We do need to invest also in diplomacy, which takes time. It's boring. There is nothing that politicians can show off all the time for the next elections. So I think that the main take is really that of the wish of the small actors, the humans, or the peoples, or the states, to have their own plurality and to be affirmed for their great variety, whatever the context may be. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been allowed to go a couple of minutes beyond schedule, but that means you have to be short and brief in your questions. I've got 4 more questions, and everything that's long goes off from your lunch, and the ability of all of us to talk with each other. So the gentleman in the 3rd row, he's the first one, and please brief.
Yeah, thank you. Really been a wonderful morning and afternoon. Sorry, cough. So I will just tell a little small joke related to the topic. I was a young guy in '73 in Dipoli in the Secretariat, and at that time there were discussions related to the topic of the conference that was planned. So what happened is there were discussions with the diplomats, delegates, and they suddenly decided that they will stop the meeting. Why? In the morning. So what happened? They said they have pencils that said made in Germany. They cannot continue the discussions. East Germany said so. Okay, so I was in charge of the logistics. So I thought, what shall I do? Which are non-political pencils. So I went to the bookstore and I was looking through all the pencils, and then I found something, a good solution, made in Hong Kong. So we brought them there, and the discussions continued. So that was a short political solution.
Thank you very much.
This is just a joke.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for the joke. Herr Weiskirchen.
All the respect to Helsinki Accord, it opened up a new path into a different future. And why? Because of the fact that Martin and Sakharov and Venslova and Lauristin were the ones to pick up the idea of what is going on, and they tried to make their own decision, self-determination, and this has been the key to a different future. And I mean, what to do now is to open up a different future.
The gentleman right on the far corner.
Thank you very much. Congratulations for your great panel. My name is Johannes. I'm from Bucharest, Romania. And my question is for any panelist who wants to answer. Shortly, 50 years later, we have a war of aggression, full-scale war in Europe. And on the other hand, what we can see in our European countries, our democracies, is the rising of far-right extremist, hard nationalist party, especially in the former communist states in Central and Eastern Europe. And if we can speak about Germany, we have a lot of discussion about Germany today. In the eastern part of Germany, in the former Democratic Republic, the most voted party is AfD, who can rule Germany, eastern part of Germany, accordingly with the voters. So my question is this a legacy of communism, because we have the rising of far-right extremist parties in all former communist states, from the Baltics to the Black Sea. And they are challenging power, and they can be in power, if not this year, next year's, in next elections. And how can we explain this situation? And do you think our democracy are going back not 50 years ago, not 80 years ago when UN Charter was signed, but 100 years ago in the Europe of the 30s with the rising of fascism? Thank you.
And there's one more here.
Thank you very much. One of the lasting legacies of the Helsinki Final Act, and not the act perhaps, but then the follow-up process, was that it established a clear link between security and human rights. And I think now in hindsight we can say that when countries do not respect human rights, they also end up being a security issue for your neighbors. So how would you comment this? Thank you.
Just very quickly on the tension, whether it's between non-interference or non-intervention and human rights. There were two cases subsequent to Helsinki when all the participating states agreed that matters relating to the human dimension are not solely the internal affair of a participating state. One at a conference, at a meeting in Moscow, which was actually mandated by Vienna based on a proposal made by Edward Shevardnadze as foreign minister of the Soviet Union in 1986. And when in 1991 they finally met in Moscow, they agreed to that principle. The other time was actually a summit meeting in which the Russian Federation, headed by Vladimir Putin, agreed to that provision in Astana. I would argue probably because it was too important not to have an agreement at a meeting that was held in the capital of Kazakhstan on the year that President Nazarbayev turned 70. But there were, in fact, those two cases, and it might be interesting to hear your comments on those.
Okay, now you are between lunch. Short, pick up whatever you want to pick up. Sia, do you want to start? And then we go.
Well,
just go
I can be fairly quick. I think that the issue about human rights is, of course, huge. The first thing to say is that we need to continue defending and discussing human rights in our own countries, first of all, because they are challenged. In this regard, I'd like particularly to raise the question of migration, because it unites many of the trends that we see also in the West and the East. And one of the core arguments is that undertakings on refugees and migration have undergone fundamental changes of circumstances. This is a legal term that wants to say that when we entered these agreements in the 40s and the 50s, the world was very different. Well, it's just to look at Winston Churchill's own reports, which said that there were about 22 million refugees and displaced persons at the end of the Second World War. We undertook these agreements precisely because there were as many refugees and displaced. There is no fundamental change of circumstances in this regard. As regards the link of human rights and security, we may want to continue the discussion during the afternoon, but it is, I believe, the reason why the work of the High Commissioner on National Minorities was so important in the early 1990s, trying to deal with many of these questions of minorities in a number of different countries around Europe. So for me, this is one of the lasting legacies of the Helsinki process, this insight that we do need to work actively with these questions and not questioning as it happens today in many countries.
We'll just go along. Sorry, we'll just go along the line.
Reacting to what Gerd Weissner said. I think it was very short comment, but very important, that we must take into consideration that we are always in some sort of new beginning. A long time ago, St. Augustine had a beautiful definition, initium esset creatus est homo, human being was created so that there is a initium, beginning in the world. Sometimes it's much easier to live with traditions, with the past, because past give us all sorts of advices, instructions, knowledge. I wouldn't like to underestimate that. But there is a gap between past and the future, and we must try to build some bridges. And I think Helsinki process in general was a great I would say, inspiration or challenge, or I don't know how to call it in that respect. There was something new in the air, but all participants tried to turn it into some sort of routine operation. Diplomats cannot do much more than that. I fully agree with you, they need to do whatever they are supposed to do by the governments. But this element of new that was around, and this is still with us, and we have to admit that we don't know exactly what to do. Action-oriented people never have a full information. They always need to work with what they have and try to transform their own experience into knowledge, which is a very difficult thing, but I think it's, for me, the centerpiece of Helsinki experience.
Martin, thank you. I think it was a good final word, and I'll leave it to lunch to discuss with all the others. Thanks a lot for the panel and for the discussion.